My name is Fiona Blackwood. I am the fourth of 7 children, a fact that sounds more like a statistic than a position in a family. We grew up in a rambling, drafty house in the misty outskirts of Portsmouth, a city that always seems to be weeping softly onto its own green reflection in the Willamette River. My parents, Dr. Arthur and Dr. Helen Blackwood, are both retired literature professors, and they curated our childhood like a sprawling, ambitious anthology. Our home wasn't just a place to live, it was a salon. The air was thick with the smell of old paper, Earl Grey tea, and the low hum of intellectual debate. My siblings are all brilliant, in that sharp, polished way that catches the light. There's Edward, the constitutional lawyer who speaks in flawless, persuasive paragraphs. Serafina, the poet, whose slim volumes win awards I don't fully understand. Twin brothers, Nathan and Daniel, are both tenured academics at prestigious East Coast universities. Then there's Beatrice, a celebrated novelist, and finally, young Benjamin, who is currently at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, naturally. They are a constellation of bright, burning stars. And then there is me. I don't have a doctorate or a book deal or a legal precedent to my name. I work in the archives of the city's historical society, where I spend my days cataloging the quiet, forgotten stories of other people's lives. I am, in the eloquent parlance of my family, the curator of the mundane. They don't say it unkindly. They don't have to. It's simply understood, a settled fact, like the constant drizzle from October to May. They are the writers. I am the reader. They are the voices. I am the audience. It's a role I have played for so long, I'd forgotten it was a role at all. I thought it was just me. The rain was streaking down the tall windows of the wine bar, blurring the city lights into a watercolor wash of gold and red. Inside, it was warm and loud, a pocket of cheer carved out of the damp November evening. "So, how was the symposium?" my friend Olivia asked, swirling the dark Cabernet in her glass. She used the word my family preferred for their annual retreat, symposium, with a gentle, knowing irony that was just for me. I blinked, pulling my focus from a droplet racing its way down the pane. "What symposium?" Olivia's smile faltered. She tilted her head, her dark curls spilling over her shoulder. "Serafina's post. It looked incredible. The lodge, the lake, she said it was the best one yet." She reached for her phone, her brow furrowed with a dawning, delicate concern. "Here, look." She turned the screen toward me. The image was breathtaking, a drone shot taken from high above. A grand, rustic lodge built of dark timber and river stone was nestled against the moody, steel-gray surface of a lake, surrounded by a dense forest of firs, their needles tipped with silver mist. On the sprawling lawn between the lodge and the water, a crowd of people was arranged in neat, smiling rows. I saw the professionally printed banner held up by my parents in the front row, the Blackwood Family Symposium 2024, a confluence of minds. I recognized every single face. My parents, Arthur and Helen, beaming. All 6 of my siblings, their spouses, their children, my nieces and nephews. There were my parents' siblings, my aunts and uncles, and their families. Cousins I hadn't seen in years. Even the in-laws of my in-laws. They were all wearing matching sweaters in a tasteful forest green, embroidered with a small, gold leaf crest. 122 people. Everyone but me. "Oh," I said. The word was a small, hollow sound, easily lost in the clatter of the bar. I forced a smile that felt like cracking plaster. "Right. That. I wasn't able to make it this year." Olivia's eyes, full of a soft, immediate understanding, met mine. She knew me too well. She saw the lie before it had even fully formed. "Oh, Fiona," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She started to put her phone away, but I held up a hand, a strange, morbid curiosity taking hold. "Let me see," I murmured. I took the phone. I scrolled. The hashtag was #BlackwoodConfluence 2024. There were dozens of photos. A lakeside brunch with champagne flutes catching the weak morning light. A group of my cousins laughing around a crackling bonfire. Edward, holding his daughter on his shoulders, pointing out at the lake. Serafina, reading from a new manuscript to a rapt audience in a great room with a vaulted ceiling and a roaring fire. My parents, slow dancing on a deck strung with fairy lights. My father's hand on the small of my mother's back, a picture of lifelong, literary love. A deep, cold knot tightened in my stomach. This wasn't a casual get-together. This was an event. It had been planned, coordinated, and curated with the same meticulous care my mother used to assemble a syllabus. A spreadsheet had existed. A block of rooms had been booked. A caterer had been hired. Those 122 matching sweaters had been ordered in a range of sizes. My mind snagged on a phone call from a month ago. I'd been at my desk, cataloging a box of letters from a pioneer woman, her spidery script describing the profound loneliness of the Oregon Trail. I had called my mother on a whim. "Mom," I'd said, tucking the phone between my ear and shoulder. "Just wondering if there are any plans for the symposium this year?" Her voice on the other end had been breezy, a little rushed. "Oh, darling, not really. Your father and I were thinking of just doing something very small. Maybe a quiet weekend at the coast, just us. The big lodges are so booked up, and honestly, coordinating everyone is just too much this year. We're scaling back." Scaling back. The words echoed in my head as I stared at the photo of 122 people. I'd believed her, of course. Why wouldn't I? I've been trained, in the quiet, accommodating way of the overlooked child, not to push. Not to ask for more details. Not to take up space. I had accepted her words at face value and thought nothing more of it. I'd simply assumed that if plans changed, if a bigger event materialized, someone would naturally think to tell me. I kept scrolling. There was a photo of the whole group, minus the drone, taken on the steps of the lodge. My absence wasn't just a detail, it was a gaping hole. A missing piece in the family puzzle, so obvious that it felt intentional. And the most painful part was the weary familiarity of it all. This wasn't a new wound, it was the tearing open of an old one. The birthday party I wasn't told about when I was 9 because it got too big. The family ski trip at 15 that I only learned of when they returned, sunburnt and laughing, my name accidentally omitted from the group text chain. The time I'd spent an entire afternoon helping my mother address and stamp invitations for a family anniversary party, only to realize later that there wasn't one for me. I handed the phone back to Olivia, my hand trembling slightly. "Wow," I said, my voice thin. "Looks like they had fun." Tears were beginning to prickle at the corners of my eyes, hot and sharp. I excused myself, navigating the crowded tables to the quiet refuge of the restroom. I locked the door and leaned against it, the cool wood a small comfort against my back. The scent of jasmine soap and damp paper towels filled the small space. I pulled out my own phone, my fingers moving on autopilot. Serafina's Instagram story was a montage of smiling faces set to the gentle, acoustic strumming of a popular indie folk band. The final slide was a boomerang of my youngest niece, her face smeared with chocolate, waving goodbye to the camera. The caption read, "Until next year. So grateful for this time to reconnect and recharge with our incredible tribe." My tribe. The tears finally came, but they were silent, efficient. The kind of tears that don't make a sound, the kind you learn to cry when you don't want to bother anyone. They slipped down my cheeks, hot tracks of grief and humiliation. I didn't sob. A sob would have felt too dramatic, too much of a performance for an audience of one. These were the quiet tears of resignation. A soft knock came at the door. "Fiona? You okay in there?" Olivia's voice was muffled, laced with worry. I took a shaky breath and cleared my throat. "Yeah, fine. Just a bit of an upset stomach. I'll be right out." "Okay. Let me know if you need anything." I waited until I heard her footsteps retreat. I stood, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at my reflection in the dim mirror. I didn't look heartbroken. I just looked empty, erased. I took a deep breath, pulled my shoulders back, and pasted on a neutral expression. It was a face I had perfected over years of family dinners and holiday gatherings, a mask of pleasant placidity. Then I unlocked the door and walked back out into the warm, noisy world, as if nothing had happened at all. I sat back down, took a sip of my wine, and even managed to laugh at a story someone was telling. No one seemed to notice the shift inside me, the quiet, seismic fracturing of something I had long tried to hold together. But I knew. I didn't need to confront them. I didn't need to demand an explanation. The explanation was there, in every smiling photo, in every coordinated sweater. Loneliness, I've learned, isn't about being alone. It's about being surrounded by people who are supposed to be yours and realizing that you're still on the outside, looking in. And in that moment, sitting in a cheerful wine bar surrounded by the ghosts of my own family, I had never felt more alone in my life. I didn't know it then, but the quiet girl who always made way, who never took up space, was about to find her voice. And it wasn't going to be quiet at all. In a family of orators, I was the listener. My childhood was a long apprenticeship in the art of being an audience. Dinners were not for eating so much as for dissecting the latest issue of the New York Review of Books. Holidays were punctuated by my siblings reading their latest poems or essays aloud, their confident voices filling the living room while I sat cross-legged on the floor, feeling the vibrations through the old hardwood. My contributions were of a different sort. I was the one who remembered to refill the teapot. I was the one who could always find my father's misplaced reading glasses. I was the one who listened, really listened, to everyone's drafts and diatribes, offering quiet nods and murmurs of encouragement. My silence was interpreted not as shyness, but as a lack of anything substantive to say. "Fiona is our anchor," my mother once explained to a visiting colleague, ruffling my hair. "She keeps the rest of us from floating away into the ether." It was meant as a compliment, I think, but it felt like being described as a piece of necessary, inanimate hardware. I tried, of course. When I was 12, I wrote a short story. It was about a little girl who discovered a hidden garden behind her house. It was simple, earnest, and full of feelings. I spent weeks on it, writing it out in my neatest cursive on good paper. I waited for the right moment, after dessert one Sunday, and cleared my throat. I wrote something, I announced to the room. A hush fell. My family, surprised, turned to look at me. It was the most attention I'd had at the dinner table in years. With trembling hands, I read my story. When I finished, the silence stretched. It wasn't a stunned, appreciative silence. It was an awkward, analytical one. Finally, Edward spoke. "The allegorical implications are a bit on the nose, don't you think? The hidden garden as a metaphor for nascent self-discovery? It's been done." "The prose is clean," my mother offered, with the gentle condescension she usually reserved for a promising but flawed undergraduate paper. "But it lacks a certain texture, darling. A voice." They didn't mean to be cruel. They were critics by nature, and they were treating my simple story with the same intellectual rigor they applied to everything else. But to a 12-year-old girl, it felt like they were dissecting not my story, but me. I never read anything aloud to them again. I didn't stop writing, though. I just went deeper underground. I started keeping journals, filling them not with elegant prose or clever allegories, but with observations. The way the light hit the dust motes in the library. The sad, hopeful look on a stranger's face on the bus. The small, overlooked moments that made up a life. I wasn't trying to be a writer. I was just trying to pay attention. Years later, in college, a friend dragged me to a live storytelling event. It was held in the back room of a dusty old bookstore, a place that smelled wonderfully of paper and rain-soaked coats. One by one, people got up on a small, makeshift stage and told a true, personal story. They weren't polished orators. Their voices sometimes cracked. They forgot their words. But they were real. And the audience didn't critique them. They listened with a kind of hungry empathy. I felt a pull, a strange sense of homecoming. A few months later, I signed up. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the sides of the wooden lectern. I told a story about my first job, shelving books at the university library, and a brief, silent friendship I'd formed with a lonely old man who came in every day to read the same book of poetry. It wasn't a grand or dramatic story. It was small. It was quiet. It was mine. When I finished, there was a beat of silence, and then the small room filled with the warmest, most generous applause I had ever heard. Someone in the front row, a woman with kind eyes, was wiping away a tear. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I realized my family was wrong. I did have a voice. It just wasn't the kind they were trained to hear. I started performing regularly at the hearth, as the event was called. It became my sanctuary. I never told my family. What was the point? To invite them felt like setting myself up for that same old, familiar silence. My small stage was my hidden garden, and this time, I wasn't going to let their critiques trample the delicate things growing there. Once, Olivia, ever my champion, tried to broach the subject with my sister Beatrice at a party. "You know, Fiona is an amazing storyteller," she'd said. "You should all come see her at the hearth sometime." Beatrice had given her a polite, blank smile. "Oh, that's sweet," she'd replied, her tone dripping with faint amusement. "It's so good she has her little hobby." A little hobby. Like macrame or collecting novelty salt and pepper shakers. The words, when Olivia relayed them to me later, stung more than any overt criticism could have. It wasn't that they thought I was bad, it was that they didn't think of me at all. I was the anchor. The quiet, solid, unremarkable thing that held the brilliant, glittering ship in place. And an anchor, by its very nature, is meant to be unseen. Meant to be left behind. The week after I saw the photos from the symposium was a blur of quiet, gray misery. I went to work. I cataloged the ephemera of other people's lives. I came home. I made tea I didn't drink and stared out the window at the rain. The pain wasn't a sharp, acute thing anymore. It had settled into a dull, heavy ache in the center of my chest, a constant, physical reminder of my own invisibility. I had a slot at the hearth that Friday. I'd planned to tell a funny, self-deprecating story about a disastrous attempt at online dating. But the words felt hollow, false. How could I stand on a stage and pretend to be lighthearted when I felt like a ghost? On Thursday night, I sat at my small writing desk, the one tucked into a corner of my living room, and I opened a fresh document. I didn't plan what I was going to write. I just let it come. I wrote about being the quiet one in a house full of noise. I wrote about the symposium, about the matching sweaters and the drone shot and the lie my mother had told me with such casual ease. I wrote about what it feels like to search for your own face in a family portrait and find only an empty space. I wasn't writing a speech or a takedown. I was writing a map of my own hurt, trying to find my way back to solid ground. When I finished, the page was full of the simplest, most honest words I had ever written. Reading them over, I felt a tremor of fear, but beneath it, a deeper, stronger current of resolve. The next night, the hearth was packed. The air was warm and smelled of coffee and old wood. Olivia was in her usual seat in the front row, giving me a small, encouraging smile. When the host called my name, I walked onto the small, brightly lit stage, leaving my notes for my other story on my chair. I had nothing in my hands. I took a deep breath, gripping the microphone stand. The light was warm on my face. Most storytellers, I began, my voice a little shaky at first, get their start because they grew up in families that treasured their stories. My family treasured stories too. Just not mine. A few soft, knowing chuckles rippled through the audience. I felt my shoulders relax, just a fraction. I grew up in a house of brilliant wordsmiths. My parents are professors, my siblings are writers and academics. Their words are like intricate, beautiful architecture. Mine always felt more like a simple tent. Functional, but not exactly inspiring. I talked about the feeling of being the permanent audience, the designated listener. I talked about learning to make myself small, to be the quiet, helpful one, the anchor. And then I took another breath. Last month, I said, my voice dropping, my mother told me they were scaling back the annual family get-together this year. That it would be something small, not enough space for everyone. And I believed her. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then last week, I saw the pictures online. A huge lakeside lodge. A professionally catered event. 122 people. A collective gasp went through the room. It was a soft, empathetic sound. There were matching sweaters, I added, a small, wry smile touching my lips. And a hashtag. The audience laughed, a warm, supportive wave of sound. So, I guess my mother was right, I concluded, my voice clear and steady now. There wasn't enough space. Not at the lodge, of course. There just wasn't enough space for me. I looked out at the sea of faces, at the kind, listening eyes. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't accused. I had simply laid my small, quiet truth out in the light. And, for the first time, it felt seen. It felt real. The applause that followed was the loudest I had ever received. It wasn't just for a well-told story. It was for the vulnerability, for the courage of speaking a painful truth aloud. As I walked off the stage, my legs trembling, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt lighter. Like I had finally set down a heavy, invisible weight I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying my whole life. The next morning, my phone rang at 8:15 a.m. It was my mother. I hesitated for a moment, then answered, a knot of apprehension tightening in my stomach. Her voice was not loud or shrill. It was worse. It was glacial. Fiona, what have you done? There was no preamble, no greeting. Just the cold, sharp edge of her disappointment. A friend of your Uncle Michael's was at that event of yours last night, she continued, the word event laced with disdain. He called Michael this morning. He told him everything you said. You stood on a public stage and you aired our family's private affairs like common gossip. It wasn't gossip, Mom, I said, my own voice quiet but firm. It was my story. It's what happened. What happened, she retorted, her voice rising now, is a private, family matter that you have twisted into a public spectacle for the entertainment of strangers. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? Your father is beside himself. You've made us look like monsters. The familiar guilt began to creep in, the old instinct to apologize, to smooth things over. But the memory of the previous night, the feeling of being heard, truly heard, was a new and powerful antidote. Did you ever consider how humiliating it was for me? I asked. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I had never spoken to her like this before. To be lied to? To be excluded from my own family? To see photos of all of you together, knowing I was the only one left out. It was a simple oversight, she snapped, but her voice lacked conviction. Things got complicated. The guest list grew. We should have called you. It was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake, I said softly. It was a choice. And last night I made a choice, too. I chose to tell the truth about how it felt. You've broken your father's heart, she whispered, her voice thick with a sorrow that I knew was real, but was also a weapon. And you've been breaking mine, quietly, for 32 years, I replied. I ended the call, my hand shaking. I didn't feel angry. I felt a profound, aching sadness for the vast, unbridgeable distance between us. By midday, the emails began to arrive. The first was from Edward. It was a long, masterfully constructed treatise on the ethical ramifications of personal narrative, citing Foucault and Didion. He accused me of a fundamental misreading of familial dynamics and of constructing a victim narrative that was both simplistic and self-serving. It wasn't an angry email, it was an intellectual assassination. Serafina's was shorter. A single, cryptic line. Some stories are wounds, and you just chose to pour salt in it for an audience. They weren't trying to understand my pain. They were trying to invalidate it, to critique it out of existence. They were putting my feelings on trial, and they had already reached their verdict. That evening, I sat on the floor of my apartment, the city lights twinkling outside my window. I thought about their words, their accusations of making a spectacle. And I realized that their version of privacy was just a more elegant word for secrecy. Their silence was a form of control. I opened my laptop, turned on the camera, and started to speak. "Hi," I said, looking directly into the small, glowing lens. I was just wearing a comfortable old sweater, my hair was messy, and there was no stage, no spotlight. Just me in my home. My name is Fiona, and I'm a storyteller. And I've learned that sometimes the most important story you can ever tell is your own. I didn't mention my family by name. I didn't need to. I spoke about the difference between privacy that protects and silence that harms. I spoke about the quiet pain of being overlooked, of feeling invisible in the places you're supposed to belong the most. For a long time, I said, my voice soft but clear, I thought my voice didn't matter because it wasn't as loud or as clever as the voices around me. But I'm starting to think that the quiet stories are the ones we need to hear the most, because they're the stories of being human. I looked into the camera one last time. If you've ever been made to feel like you don't have a right to your own story, I said, I see you. You have a right. It's yours. Tell it. I posted the video to the small Facebook page I had for my storytelling. I closed my laptop, and for the first time since that phone call with my mother, I felt a sense of profound, unshakable peace. I had taken their narrative, their carefully constructed world of intellectual superiority and curated harmony, and I had placed my small, quiet truth right in the middle of it. And I waited to see what would grow in its place. The video didn't just find an audience, it found a nerve. It was shared once, then a dozen times, then hundreds. People I didn't know left comments, long, heartfelt paragraphs about their own families, their own experiences of being the quiet one, the disappointment, the anchor. The hashtag they created, #TellYourStory, began to trend locally. An editor from a popular online magazine that focused on personal essays sent me an email. A producer for a local public radio show asked if I'd be willing to come on air. My small, private act of self-reclamation had become a public conversation. And my family, who had built their entire identities around controlling the narrative, had lost control completely. 2 weeks after I posted the video, on a Saturday morning thick with fog, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole, and my heart dropped into my stomach. It was my parents, Arthur and Helen, and standing just behind them were Edward and Serafina. They looked like a delegation, assembled and grim. I opened the door but stood firmly in the doorway, blocking their entrance. "Fiona," my father said, his voice heavy with a forced, paternal authority. "We need to talk. This has gone far enough." "You've created a firestorm," Edward added, his lawyerly gaze sweeping over me as if assessing a hostile witness. "You've embarrassed this family in a way that will have lasting repercussions. We came here to ask you, to implore you, to take the video down," my mother said. Her face was pale, her expression a mixture of anger and deep, theatrical sorrow. "And to issue some kind of retraction. A clarification. A clarification." They wanted me to tell the world that my truth wasn't true. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the space between us with the weight of a stone. They stared at me, genuinely shocked. I had never said no to them like this. Not about anything important. "I won't be taking it down," I continued, my voice steady, my gaze moving from one to the other. "And I won't be retracting anything, because it was the truth." "It was your truth," Serafina corrected, her voice sharp as broken glass. "A subjective, emotionally driven interpretation of complex events." "It's the only truth I have," I replied. "And for the first time in my life, I'm not going to apologize for it." I looked at my mother. "You want to talk about embarrassment?" I was embarrassed when I had to lie to my friend about why I wasn't at a family retreat with 122 other people. I was embarrassed every time I sat silently at the dinner table while you all discussed books I hadn't read and theories I didn't understand. I have spent my entire life being quietly embarrassed for not being you. I'm done. A fragile, terrible silence fell. My father looked, for the first time I could remember, utterly lost for words. Edward's jaw was tight. Serafina looked away, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Can we at least come inside?" my mother asked, her voice softening, shifting tactics. "Let's not have this conversation on your doorstep, for heaven's sake." I looked past them, to the quiet, tree-lined street. I looked at the threshold of my own apartment, this small space that was the only place in the world that felt entirely mine. And I knew what I had to do. "No," I said again, this time more gently. "I'm sorry, but you can't come in." This space, I gestured behind me, to my little living room with its mismatched furniture and overflowing bookshelves. "This is my home. And you're not welcome in it right now. Not until you can see me, really see me, and not just the problem I've become for you." It was the hardest thing I had ever said. It felt like severing a limb. But it also felt like breathing for the first time. My mother's eyes filled with tears of genuine, wounded shock. My father simply shook his head, a look of profound disappointment settling on his face. Edward opened his mouth to say something, another legalistic rebuttal, but I held up a hand. "Please," I said. "Just go." And without another word, I closed the door. I leaned against it, my whole body trembling, and listened as their footsteps receded down the hall. I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollowed out, but also strangely whole. The quiet girl who curated the mundane had finally curated a boundary. It was a small space, just the size of a one-bedroom apartment, but it was hers. In the weeks that followed, the silence from my family was absolute. I learned through Olivia, who had heard it from a mutual acquaintance, that they had sold the big house in the Portsmouth Hills, the house I grew up in. The official story was that they were downsizing, moving to a smaller, more manageable condo downtown. But I knew the truth. They were retreating. They were trying to escape the narrative they could no longer control. I didn't rejoice. There was a deep, lingering grief for the family I wished I'd had, for the connection I had craved for so long. But as the months passed, that grief began to be outweighed by a quiet, steady sense of peace. It's been a year. The rain is falling outside my window, a familiar, comforting rhythm against the glass. My apartment is filled with the warm, sweet smell of baking bread. I've taken up baking. I like the precision of it, the way simple, honest ingredients can be transformed into something that nourishes. I no longer work at the Historical Society. The essays and radio appearances led to a book deal, not a volume of esoteric poetry or a groundbreaking novel, but a collection of my stories. It's called The Quiet Part Loud, and it comes out in the spring. I also teach a workshop now, at the Hearth, helping other people find the courage to tell their own stories. My life is smaller than I ever imagined it would be. It's not filled with grand pronouncements or prestigious awards. It's filled with good friends like Olivia, with the rich aroma of coffee, the weight of a good book in my hands, and the quiet satisfaction of my own work. It's a simple tent, but it keeps me warm and dry. I have not spoken to my parents or my siblings. The door I closed that day has remained closed. Sometimes, late at night, I feel a pang of loss so sharp it takes my breath away. The ghost of the girl who just wanted to be invited to the party still lives inside me. But she's quieter now. I don't know if the rift will ever be healed. Reconciliation requires an acknowledgement of the wound, and I don't know if they are capable of that. Perhaps some families are like texts that can never be fully translated. You can love the source material, but you can never truly inhabit its world. But this morning, something new happened. An email appeared in my inbox. It was from my youngest brother, Benjamin, the Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. The subject line just said, "Hi." The email was short. "Fiona." I've been reading some of your essays online. Mom and Dad don't know. I just wanted to say, I hear you. I've always heard you. Yours, Ben. I read it 3 times. Tears pricked my eyes, but for the first time in a very long time, they were not tears of pain or loneliness. They were something else entirely. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a reunion. It was just a small, quiet acknowledgement. A single voice, breaking from the chorus. A crack of light under a door I thought was sealed forever. I don't know what I will write back. I don't know what comes next. But as I sit here in my quiet apartment, with the rain falling and the smell of bread in the air, I feel a sense of space around me. A space that is all my own, that no one can take away. And I know, with a certainty that settles deep in my bones, that it is more than enough.